Hi there and welcome back. Today we'll be talking about Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot. If you saw my video on the Tower of London, you might have heard a brief mention of this guy as he was one of the prisoners at the tower. And if you haven't seen that video, go watch it. Hello! I had actually never heard of Guy Fawkes, and certainly not Guy Fawkes Day, until researching the Tower of London. And upon learning a little bit about him, I was instantly intrigued and needed to know more. How did this guy who attempted to blow up Parliament end up with a day named after him? Well, let's find out. Guy Fawkes was presumably born on April 13th in definitely 1570 in York, England. He was the second of 4 children born to Edward and Edith Fawkes. Both of his parents were devout members of the Church of England. In 1579, when Guy was only 8 years old, his father Edward died. His mother ended up remarrying a man by the name of Dennis Bainbridge a few years later. It was then that Guy converted to Catholicism, and this wasn't completely out of left field considering Dennis was a Catholic and his mother's side of the family had been Catholic as well. In 1593, he left England and enlisted in the Spanish army. Over the next 10 years, Guy would fight with the Spanish and would eventually change his name or fight under the name Guido. During this time, he fought against Protestant rebels and petitioned the King of Spain for help in rebelling against King James of England, who was against Catholicism. For a little bit of a backstory, around the time of Guy's birth, Queen Elizabeth I had actually been excommunicated by the Pope, and thus Catholicism was heavily repressed in England. Priests were put to death, and Catholics couldn't participate in Mass. When King James I took the throne in 1603 after Elizabeth's death, it was thought things would get better for Catholics and that James himself might even convert. However, by 1604, he condemned Catholicism just as his predecessor had and continued instituting many of the same policies against Catholics and their religious freedoms. As you can probably imagine, Catholics were fed up with the repressive policies and the fines that were being placed on them. This led to them attempting to organize themselves several times to conspire against both Elizabeth and then James throughout the years. In 1603 alone, there were 2 plots, the by-plot and the main plot, both against James. One was to kidnap James, and the other was to murder him, respectively. Both of these, of course, failed. Now, back to James formally condemning Catholicism in 1604. As you can imagine, the Catholics were crushed, and thus another plot was formed. Guy had been rising through the ranks of the Spanish military and also increasing his knowledge of, you guessed it, gunpowder. It was in 1604 that Fawkes was recruited by Thomas Winter to join the group of conspirators who would one day become famous for their attempt on the king's life as well as all of Parliament. This group of conspirators started as early back as May 1603 when Robert Catesby, mastermind of the plot, told Thomas Percy that he was thinking of a way to kill King James. And Percy had also expressed his intention to kill King James as well. This was the beginning of the group. Next to become involved in the plot would be Catesby's cousin, Thomas Winter. He initially refused in November of 1603, but later agreed in January of 1604 after some further coaxing. He joined alongside John Wright. Fawkes was recruited by, as I mentioned, Thomas Winter in May of 1604, both for his strong religious beliefs and his knowledge of explosives. These initial 5 were said to have met, swore themselves to secrecy, and began plotting. Over time, others included in the plot were Robert Keyes, Robert Winter, John Grant, Kit Wright, Thomas Bates, Ambrose Rookwood, Francis Tresham, and Sir Everard Digby. The plan was initially formed. First, they attempted to dig under Parliament, but soon found out that they could instead rent out a cellar that happened to be located right under the House of Lords, to which they were initially digging. Here they began stockpiling gunpowder. They ended up collecting 36 barrels of gunpowder with the intention of, not so subtly, blowing the roof off the joint with King James, his son, and all of Parliament inside. Fawkes was to set the fuse on November 5th, 1605, when they had all met during the opening of a new session of Parliament. After lighting the fuse, he was going to escape via boat on the River Thames. In the meantime, his pals had their own laundry list of things to do. This included causing a stir in the English Midlands and kidnapping King James's daughter, Elizabeth, with the intention of temporarily installing her as a queen until she was to be married off to a suitable Catholic man. Easy peasy, Catholic monarchy rises again. Except not so easy peasy though. Their plans were foiled when an anonymous letter arrived on October 26th to warn William Parker, a Catholic sympathizer, that he needed to avoid the opening of Parliament. William Parker was family to Tresham, one of the conspirators, and it is therefore assumed that the letter was sent by him not only to warn Parker, but to stop the plot while also allowing the conspirators time to escape. The letter was read aloud to company instead of privately as was intended, and a chain of events was set off that would lead to the group being found out. The letter and its contents made its way to the king on November 1st, and on November 4th, the House of Lords was searched. During the search, they found Fawkes hanging out by some firewood. He claimed that the firewood was for his master, as he was pretending to be his servant throughout the entire plotting period, and he gave them the name Thomas Percy. Upon hearing the name Thomas Percy, their ears perked up, as Percy was known to be a known Catholic agitator. This led them to doing a second and more thorough search, in which they again found Fawkes, and he had matches, touchwood, and eventually they found the 36 barrels of gunpowder. No big deal. After the other conspirators heard of his arrest, they were off. While they were escaping, the king and his men were interrogating John Johnson, aka Guy Fawkes. He initially gave them no information and insisted that the plot had been his and his alone. On November 6, 1605, Fawkes was moved to the Tower of London. Fawkes spent all day being tortured on November 6th, but his Roman resolution, as King James had called it, continued to hold. By November 7th, he had given in to the unimaginable torture he was being put under and confessed to the full crime while also giving up the names of the other conspirators. He gave a full confession again on November 8th and November 9th. Meanwhile, a group of the conspirators who had escaped and met up were trying to enlist people to put up a final fight. No one was willing to get involved in this last-ditch effort, though. Not long after, Catesby, Rookwood, Grant, and a member of the hunting party ran into further misfortune when the gunpowder they had set out to dry in front of the fire had caught fire, engulfing them in flames. They had survived the fire, but Grant had been blinded. This didn't stop them, though. Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, Catesby, Grant, Rookwood, and the Wright brothers then made their final stand at Hobesh House. Here, Catesby, Percy, and the Wright brothers were killed, while Grant, Rookwood, and Thomas Winter were arrested. By December, the other 5 who were still at large were captured, and only Robert Winter remained free. Also in December, Tresham died in the Tower of London. Robert Winter was finally captured around the time that the trial started, which was January 27, 1606. Of the 8 who remained, all were found guilty of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a brutal death, including being hanged until near death, having their genitals cut off, as well as their heart and bowels removed while alive, and then they were to be decapitated, dismembered, and displayed for all of the public to see. Digby, Robert Winter, and Grant were executed on January 30th, 1606. Thomas Winter, Rookwood, Keyes, and Fawkes would die the next day. Interestingly enough, seconds before being hanged, Fawkes is said to have jumped from the platform, causing his neck to snap and die instantly. Many believe he did this to avoid the excruciating torture of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. He had already been tortured enough. While the intent of the plot was to bring freedom back to Catholics, the failure of the plot meant more stifling restrictions than ever before. They couldn't practice law, serve as officers in the military, vote in elections, and they were blamed for everything, like the Great Fire in London. They didn't even regain their right to vote until 1829. Guy Fawkes, although not the lead conspirator in the plot, did come to represent the plot. Today, Guy Fawkes Day is celebrated on November 5th every year in Britain to commemorate the failed plot. There are fireworks, effigies in the likeness of Fawkes are burned, and bonfires are lit, lending the alternate name Bonfire Night. Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot have been portrayed in movies and TV shows. He's had masks made in his likeness, and more. The masks are even often worn by those who are protesting or are part of anti-establishment, anti-government movements. Anonymous is a great example of a collective that utilizes the masks and represents these values. Like a lot of things in history, his legacy has changed over time. He's come to represent rebellion, anarchy, and subversion versus a religious extremist who tried to blow up a king in all of Parliament. After learning about him and his plan, I can personally see how his legacy has come to be shaped in this way. In essence, he was tired of his religion being suppressed by the government and took action against them, so it kind of makes sense that he would come to represent anti-government sentiment and rebellion. In short, his portrayal, over time, seems to have romanticized him and the group's actions. What did they expect, though? There are nursery rhymes about the day, and a day named after him. I remember my first time hearing, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November," was in the voice of Matt Smith. I can't remember if it was in regards to the Doctor Who game or in an actual episode, but I never knew what historical relevance it actually had until learning about Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot. It's likely familiar to a lot of people from V is for Vendetta. V is for Vendetta is a comic book turned movie based on a masked anarchist who tries to ignite a revolution with the Gunpowder Plot as his inspiration. This explains his use of the mask, taking up Guy Fawkes as his identity, and even referencing the rhyme in the movie. In case you're unfamiliar, the main part of the rhyme goes like this. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. I know I'll definitely never forget. And that is all I have. Thank you for joining me again today as we went over another person and another event throughout history. I'll see you next time. Ay.